It's the week ending Saturday the 26th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the UK government begin a consultation into privatising Channel 4, Britney Spears speaking out against her conservatorship at a court hearing in Los Angeles, and John McAfee, the antivirus entrepreneur, found dead in a prison cell at the age of 75. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it is the boss man, Holden Frith, from the Week magazine, editor Theo Tait, and from the excellent daily podcast, The Retrospectors, although I'm not exactly impartial on that, Arion McNicoll. And Holden, you are starting us off today. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are some communes more equal than others?
The ideology was everything. And they were willing to sacrifice everything for the ideology.
There's no way without a total devotion that they could build the kibbutz. And the only way was possibly this way, of communal life, everybody shares everything. And they looked for the hardest place. If you look at the borders of Israel, there is no Israel without the kibbutzim around in the borders.
Leoba Dayan and other members of a kibbutz community speaking in a short documentary you can catch on TBN Israel's YouTube channel. Holden, what's the story?
Well, what's happened is that the New York Times has drawn attention this week to a long-running dispute between the residents of a northern Israeli city called Bet Shean and a neighbouring kibbutz. At its most basic, it's a pretty minor neighbourhood row about essentially who gets to float down an idyllic-looking river and who can land.
And it is worth saying it is a beautiful-looking river, isn't it? Aquamarine water, 28 degrees all year round, surrounded by holiday villas.
Yeah, and if you think of the image as a kind of lazy country park kind of a stream with well-manicured banks, and you can see why this would be appealing, particularly in an area which is essentially desert around the edge.
Surrounded by arid landscape, yeah. It looks like Carolina or something.
Yeah, if you look on Google Maps, you can see very clearly why this particular piece of land might be appealing. And at this point, because we're talking about Israel, it might seem safe to assume we're talking about Jewish Israelis trying to keep out Arab Israelis or Palestinians. But in fact, this dispute is actually between two groups of Jewish Israelis. And I think it's one that reveals some of the tensions and some of the cross-currents in Israeli society that often get lost when we're only looking at the country through the lens of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Okay, well, before we pontificate too much about that, let's just go back to basics quickly for those who don't know. What is the kibbutz movement? And what role do the kibbutzim play in Israel today? Yeah,
this particular kibbutz called Nir David is a really good example of the movement as a whole. It was founded in 1936, so it predates not only the neighbouring town, but actually the state of Israel itself. It was populated by mostly Ashkenazi Jews who came from all across Europe. And they were really, they were staking a claim to what they hoped would become their homeland and what then did become a Jewish homeland. And they were really pioneers of Israel's identity. Their values of resilience, cooperation, self-reliance are still a core part of that national culture. The idea was that they would be, essentially socialist communes where people would share agricultural duties, share the raising of children, and in this quite hostile landscape, they would create a garden that could sustain them.
Yeah, so Arion, the socialist kibbutzim created these landscapes that came to define modern Israel, really. But although they were socialist and sort of theoretically open to everybody who wanted to come and join in who was a Zionist, really in reality that was Ashkenazi Jews, so Jews that originally had come from Eastern Europe, Russia and Poland and so on.
Yeah, that's right. And complicating things yet further is the fact that the kibbutz itself and kibbutzim all over the country have really changed quite a lot in the intervening years since their foundation and today. And quite a lot of that socialist origin story has been swept aside as they kind of become more capitalist, though not all of them. Some of them still do have kind of communal ideologies at their hearts. But that sort of population by the Ashkenazis was going on slightly separately, and then the Sephardic or Mizrahis who came afterwards, some kind of 10, 20 years afterwards, they struggled to integrate with one another in many cases. And this, as a microcosm of that, is a really good example, because you have these traditional Ashkenazis who occupy the kibbutz itself, now waging war over whether they're going to let in the Mizrahis from the local village or not, and whether they're going to allow them to sail down this quite idyllic kind of river.
Okay. I mean, waging war when you're talking about Israel-Palestine is a complicated term, isn't it? Let's try and be realistic about what's actually happening here, Theo. There are a group of people who don't live in the kibbutz that would like access to the river that runs through the kibbutz. You can see that there's a legitimate debate there on both sides, can't you, between the kibbutzim who say, well, it's private land and we live here, and if you were part of our cooperative, you could use it, but you can't because you're not, and the people on the outside who say, well, it's Israeli law that all rivers are public, so we should use it. That's what this is about.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to have been going on a very long time as well. Like right back to 2010, they've been protesting, and he says we were talking about a sort of battle. I mean, people have been beaten up apparently over scuffles about this. The head of tourism in the kibbutz was beaten up, but it is sort of ironic, isn't it, that the kibbutz has become like a sort of gated community. The sort of socialist dream has ended up with this sort of amazing place where they rent out these sort of Airbnb chalets which have access to the lovely river going through, and then you have these people from the local town who are kind of furious and would like to get in.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good argument against the kibbutz, isn't it, Holden? Their argument doesn't hold as much water as they'd like to think in terms of it being their private land, since they are basically saying, well, you can come and live here if you pay us, you just can't come and use it for free. Yeah,
their argument is, well, there's a range of different ones, one of which is that they created this idyllic space. They widened the river, they've certainly lined it, they've landscaped the banks, they've created the gardens. One 71-year-old resident sort of, gesturing to the reporter in the New York Times says, yes, of course, everyone would love to come and live here, it's beautiful, but it's impossible, we live here, this place was nurtured by us. There is a real sense of that, the clash between the ideals and the idealism, and the wanting to create a perfect place, but then what happens when the outsiders want to come into the place, as they obviously would. And I think one of the interesting things here is that the local town is mostly working class socioeconomically. It's generally quite right-wing. It's tended to back parties on the right of Israeli politics, whereas the people who live in the kibbutz are generally associated with the left of Israeli politics, although this is a case that has really divided the left, because you have the sort of establishment parties are very unwilling to criticize the kibbutz movement, which is associated with that kind of elite group of Israelis, but also with that founding ideology. But other activist groups on the left have tended to back the campaigners who want in on the grounds of racial equality and also just open access to land.
Yeah, I mean, the politics does seem a bit upside down, doesn't it, Arion? So you have the socialist kibbutzim who want to keep their land private, and the Netanyahu supporting right-wing who are backing public access for an immigrant group. It does tell you something about the complexities that are going on in that part of the world.
Yes, and I think this is a really good small sample of a broader question in the political sense, because actually all of the complexities that you describe, Olly, really do speak to the way that Netanyahu managed to, as part of his political strategy to stay in power, kind of subdivide people from one another. And he profited, as we've been speaking about, from the right-wing vote of the Mizrahis, of the kind who lived in the local village rather than this kibbutz, as opposed to the Ashkenazi Jews more broadly, who tend to vote more leftist and centrist across the country. But it's been to his benefit throughout his political career to kind of keep those groups antagonistic towards one another, and really it's only fallen apart very recently, as we've seen with the most recent spate of elections, as really a bunch of very unexpected allies have come together to oust him that really involved the far left and the far right, and even Palestinian and Arab groups, all coming together to just get rid of him, sort of partly, at least according to the analysis I've seen, because they were sick of the divisions that he was sowing in society, among other reasons.
And it's interesting, isn't it, Theo, that these divisions are sometimes missed in the British media when Israel-Palestine is reported, because that's the big fault line, between, I suppose, broadly Jews and Arabs. That gets reported, obviously. But the fact that Israelis themselves have been unable to elect a government, have been unable to agree on what they want the direction of their country to be, are very divided on whether they supported Netanyahu, That, as I say, it's complex and often kind of doesn't really get interpreted for us very well.
Yeah, I hadn't realised at all that, in fact, the rise of Likud, which is Netanyahu's party, was entirely being powered by Mizrahi voters who came mostly in the 60s when they were booted out of other Arab countries when during the Arab-Israeli conflict. And you had these sort of towns, that the local town, Beit Shehan, is what's called a development town, where they basically dumped all these Mizrahis in these sort of towns, which were strategically chosen to be places that the Israeli state wanted to develop, but they were often very hard to live in. So you have these sort of very deep sort of conflicts going through the story.
And I think as well you have here a current that you see elsewhere across the world but often is missed in Israel, which is that new migrants and often working class migrants are much more assertive about their new national identity, and in this case perhaps also their religious identity, and that intersects, or has at least been used by Netanyahu and Likud for the purposes of sort of nation building and or even of sort of reasserting Israel's identity as a Jewish state. Whereas I think those on the left of Israeli politics and particularly on the kibbutz are often less religious in their cultural identity. In fact, some kibbutzes are more avowedly atheist. So I think you do see here it's all elements of the debates in Israeli society have come together in this dispute around an idyllic little stream.
What does it mean for the future of the kibbutz, Arion? I mean, obviously this particular basically little row is unlikely to really mean anything fundamental, but as we've been saying, it indicates quite a lot, doesn't it? Is that kind of ethnically Jewish but essentially atheist vision of a socialist cooperative kind of now seen as a bit 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that the traditional view of the kibbutznik as founder and ideologue and kind of moral core of the country of Israel is starting to shatter, if not that it's shattered already. And I think that the future of the kibbutzim in general, I don't think they're in any trouble. I think that they're going to continue, but they have fundamentally changed from what they were at the beginning. And I think that this kind of conflict will only serve to underline the tensions that exist within Israeli society more broadly that could spill over into people becoming increasingly hostile towards kibbutzniks in general.
Which is interesting, Theo, isn't it? Because they were sort of untouchable for a while. And if you look below the fold of Israeli newspaper articles on this kind of subject, you will have people saying, ordinary Israelis saying, these are the guys who built our country. Obviously, Arab Israelis may not feel exactly that way, but a lot of Israelis just feel like the people who built the kibbutzes are the people who built modern Israel. They're beyond criticism.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that the Nir David kibbutz says that they are now 40% Mizrahi in their population. So they would probably say it's a bit more nuanced than that. And in fact, we talk about them as recent immigrants. In fact, we're looking back at really the 1960s, maybe the 70s. And in fact, they are very well established in lots of ways. And I think a lot of in the big cities, they're doing very well. So, but there obviously are sort of deep underlying differences of sort of political outlook.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that in the last 12 or so minutes, we've turned a lot of nuanced things into generalisations so that we can talk about this. I appreciate listeners in Israel may feel that we're not talking about this with the expertise they would like. Holden, what do you think is next for this story, though? Why have you chosen it as your story of the week?
Well, I think it does have a lot of the feeling of a parable, and that may be because we are looking at it from afar and seeing it in slightly simplified terms. But I think it's impossible to look at it and not see some sort of intersection with the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. Because, if you're talking about fences and homelands and access, the parallels are just too clear. But here it's everything is topsy-turvy. It's the right that's in the role of the Gazans protesting against a blockade, and it's the kibbutzniks who seem to be settlers trying to defend their territory against outsiders. So I started with a reference to George Orwell. It would be far too optimistic to think that this is something that people will look at and learn the error of their ways, but it certainly feels as if it has that sort of a literary element to it that puts something we've maybe become very familiar with into sharp contrast.
Okay, painting with grand colours here today, Arion. The gauntlet has been laid. I'll be coming to you for your story next. Okay, Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we discovered that Americans are just a bunch of quitters.
So as we say, delayed quits are a big thing. A lot of people were maybe thinking of quitting their jobs before the pandemic, during the pandemic. Obviously, this was a very difficult time to quit your job. And now things are reopening. And public health situation is much better. So a lot of people are finally making that decision that maybe they were delaying.
Reporter Denitsa Sakova on Yahoo Finance last week. Arion, is this your way of resigning from the podcast?
Actually not. I'm going to stick around for as long as you'll have me. But I'm in the minority because apparently, at least in the States, reports this week revealed that more Americans quit their jobs in April, month before last, than during any other month on record going back right to the beginning of the century. And fascinatingly, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics found that for every 100 low-wage workers, such as people who work in hotels and restaurants and bars and so on, 5 of them quit in April. And the same is true of higher-paid workers. Last month, 700,000 workers in the more sort of white-collar category of professional and business services left their job, which again is the highest monthly number on record.
Highest by how much, though? I mean, it's interesting, but how long have these statistics gone back for, and how unusual is this?
The statistics go back to the start of the millennium. So we're talking about 20 years, which is a fair amount of time to be able to assess, an unusual happening. And in terms of the differentiation between other points, it's a good 0.5% higher than at any other point in history since they've been assembling these numbers.
Okay, so, I mean, I can see very much how that would be significant to any of us who are employed. Why your story of the week? What are the implications? Do you think it's going to come here to Britain as well, people resigning?
Yeah, well, interestingly, even though the stats aren't bearing out yet that in the UK we're seeing the same percentage of people quitting, certainly people in the UK are showing the same intention to quit. So as many as 40% of UK white-collar workers have said in a recent survey that they would like to change jobs this year. So yeah, it's a phenomenon that we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic. And in terms of what it means, I mean, I think that's one that we're going to want to unpack more generally. But actually, I think there's often this feeling that quitting it kind of gets a bad rap. It's associated with pessimism and laziness and a lack of confidence in workers. But in terms of labour economics, a whole lot of quitting signifies, in fact, the exact opposite, which is a great deal of confidence among workers that if they step down from their current position, they're going to find other work. So actually it speaks to there being quite a lot of jobs available in the market. And I think that is the thing that is unusual, particularly coming out of the pandemic, that which has been such a bleak time for employees. It looks like actually we're coming into a period of growth.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what the news has been telling us for the last year, isn't it, Theo? We've been told we're about to have this huge recession, that the government needs to step in to shore up everyone's jobs because there aren't going to be enough jobs to go around, and we're going to have an unemployment crisis, and it's going to affect people at every level. And yet here you have people who are servers in restaurants and white-collar professionals in city businesses saying, actually, I'm confident enough to just step away from this.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're probably doing it for quite different reasons. I mean, I think the understanding is that white-collar workers probably have quite a lot of money saved up, so therefore it gives them, a bit of a cushion. And a lot of people may have been hanging on to jobs they didn't particularly like, lower down the income scale. Now they think they've probably got opportunities to find other jobs. But yeah, imagine a lot of people, everyone's got outside the daily grind during the pandemic, and it's allowed them to think about what they want to do, and they're probably making a lot of changes in their lives.
We've talked a few times on the podcast over the last year and a bit, Holden, about kind of side hustling, for want of a better phrase, people who perhaps do jobs like you guys do. They've got a job working for an organisation, they use their brain in their job, but now finding themselves at home in the same place where they no longer have to commute anywhere. They have a few extra hours to build a website or try a new business or even just volunteer for someone. And suddenly they think, I'm not sure I really want to do this main job anymore.
Yeah, I think that it does seem that one part of what has been driving this is a bit of a reassessment, really, after the pandemic. And perhaps, as Theo says, some people have clung on to any job they had for the past year because it's felt that there's been too much change and you just want that security. But now that hopefully we are coming to the end of this disruptive experience and there's people have had more time at home, or they've been able to move somewhere else in the country, or they thought they might like to move somewhere else in the country. Perhaps they are now thinking of they have the confidence, and perhaps they have a little bit of money in the bank saved up, and so they are able to take a leap that they might not otherwise have done. And also just thinking that they've reassessed their priorities. Perhaps they do want to spend more time with their family, or perhaps they're in a job that they have been able to do from home, and their boss is now trying to get them back into the office, and they're thinking that maybe they don't want to do that either.
I should say that during the whole of that monologue, Arion was nodding vigorously, almost as if you were a psychic medium tapping into his thoughts. Well, Arion, I mean, you in the last year went freelance from your staff job. You are now about to move to the countryside from London because you no longer need to be in central London. I mean, this is sort of a story about you, isn't it?
Well, in my case, I didn't quit exactly. I was actually made redundant last year, but it did give me the opportunity to do the same thing that quitting people are doing and reconsider what I had been doing and what I wanted to do next, and even where I want to live. As you say, Olly, I'm now moving out of London and down to the countryside, and I think a lot of people are in this same boat, thinking about what they've been doing, where they're living, what they would like to do with their lives, and that's kind of what's prompting this mass reconsideration, and for many people, that's kind of leading them in the direction of maybe considering quitting their jobs.
What challenge does that present to you, Theo, as a line manager? I mean, if too many members of your staff came to you so that it actually became awkward and you would be losing resources and you needed to keep them, do you think you'd be inclined to start seeing if you can help in ways that perhaps wouldn't have occurred to you before?
I mean, I think we have, I guess, like lots of people have this sort of balance, which is that on the one hand, you need a certain amount of people in one place to make a magazine run properly, because you need to have the conversations and you need to have it's really helpful to be able to look at a screen with two people rather than doing it over Zoom or whatever, or over email. On the other hand, obviously everyone now wants to work at least 2 days a week at home. Some people don't really want to come back in at all. So it's kind of a tricky balance.
In fact, that raises a question about one of the other things that I saw as being a potential aspect of this, which is that employers are seeing this really high turnover among their newest employees, particularly the ones that they acquired during the pandemic. So I do wonder whether exactly what you're saying is true, that something about being in the same space, being able to huddle around the same computer or whatever, focal point you're working on, does bond people in a way that when you're all working remotely, you don't have a bond. And I wonder whether quite a lot of the people quitting, at least the new people quitting, just haven't felt that same connection to, core and company, as it were, that longer term employees who've actually been in the office do.
Well, who knew, Holden, that human relationships might depend on more than just meeting each other over video conferencing software via California? I mean, we were talking just before we started recording about the two newest recruits to the Week's digital team, Tait and Julia, and how you'd only just met them. You've only just met them for the first time a couple of weeks ago in a shared London workspace that you've been using. I mean, I don't intend for you to disclose whether you think that they are more committed or less committed to to your website than anyone else. But it's a point, isn't it? Like, it would be mad to expect that they would be as committed as someone who'd worked alongside you for years.
It's something we've been really conscious about, something I've been conscious about, and I think as a team we have to try to recreate something that felt like the sort of welcome drinks, the lunch that might have happened had we been in the office together, because for the first few months of both of their time in their jobs, we couldn't meet up at all. But it has been, I think, it's been a real step forward to be able to start making these tentative steps back towards normality and using some shared office spaces. But I think what Arion was saying about the fact that that a lot of people, and I hope this doesn't apply to Kate and Julia, that a lot of people who have started during the pandemic have then left. I think that also does speak to A, to the importance of people feeling they are part of a team, but B, it does suggest there's a confidence that people will be able to find another job, will be able to find a job that does give them that sense of belonging. And that definitely feels like it's a new development, and perhaps a longer term shift in power away from employers and towards employees, if they're kind of going into a job with not exactly a list of demands, but a list of expectations, not only about the work they'll be doing, but the sort of settings they'll be doing it in and the sort of relations they'll have with people that they're working with.
I wonder as well, Theo, what this means politically, for the Labour Party, for the trade union movement. Obviously there are still workers' rights that are worth fighting for, particularly in low-paid jobs and transient jobs, but there's clearly a willingness amongst a demographic who previously wanted a job for life to actually have a sort of no-strings job that they might decide to quit and go off and start something else. I mean, that's partly that circumstance, but obviously there's also some autonomy there. They want that.
I think the hope is on the left and in the Labour Party that there has been a kind of paradigm shift, and that workers will suddenly get a lot more power now. If you look, there's suddenly a load of vacancies. And particularly in Britain, because of Brexit, we've obviously, and pandemic combined, we've lost a very large, several hundreds of thousands of Europeans have gone home. So I think the hope is that from the left that this will allow people really to have much more leverage. But there is also the question of furlough, which I don't quite understand. That basically we seem to have both massive vacancies and a very large amount of people still on furlough at the moment. So it's quite hard to tell how that's going to balance out. And it seems that sometimes that they're the same people that, people who are in the hospitality industry simultaneously still has loads of people on furlough and loads of vacancies. Doesn't quite make sense to me, but I think we'll have to see how it all smooths out over the next few months.
And I think some of that, the figures we talked about having a lot of people intending to leave a job but not actually having left the job yet, that might be partly accounted for people who are on furlough, and so there's no reason for them to move on. But they may either be going back to a job that they're planning to leave, or there may actually no longer be a job for them to go back to. And so I think the UK job market still is in a bit of a state of suspended animation. So we're not going to know exactly how things will pan out until furlough ends, and presumably we will see some involuntary redundancies at that point, as well as people who are glad for a chance to move on.
I think that's a really good point as well, Holden, about the difference between intention to quit or desire to quit and actually following through with it and quitting. Because who among us can ever say that they've not worked in a job where you've thought, for months even, today's the day, I'm definitely going to just chuck it all in. And actually, you often don't end up doing it just because actually there's a purpose in keeping a regular wage coming in. So, yeah, I think you're right that it will remain to be seen whether, particularly for those people who say they want to quit and haven't yet, whether they follow through with it.
Okay, I'm quitting this conversation. Theo, I'm coming to you after this. All right, Theo, you are finishing the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It will, of course, go down in history as the week when One Britain, One Nation Day was first celebrated. I'm actually surprised you had to ask me.
We are Britain and we have one dream, to unite all people in one great team. We are Britain and we have one dream, to unite all people in one great team.
One Britain, Great Nation, a catchy tune created for One Britain, One Nation Day. If that has passed us by for whatever reason, Theo, what is One Britain, One Nation Day?
Well, it's a new initiative, which is that on Friday this week, today, children around Britain are encouraged to sing this new song, which has been created specially for the occasion, and to celebrate One Britain, One Nation Day, which is a day of national pride. And the story first appeared, I first saw it, I imagine, like a lot of people on Twitter, with this, people sort of making jokes about this sort of slightly North Korean-y sounding song about how Britain is a strong nation. And obviously everyone was incredibly mean about it, as they often are on Twitter, and they compared it to Empire Day, to the Soviets, to the Hitler Youth, and lots of people just said the song was totally crap as well. And there were all sorts of problems with it, because obviously Scotland schools are already broken up, so if it's celebrated this week, they couldn't actually sing it, so what kind of nation is that? And also, Northern Ireland isn't actually in Great Britain, so what's Britain, and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, behind it turns out there's actually really rather a sort of nice story, which is that the One Britain, One Nation, or OBON, as I believe it's known, was set up by this former police inspector, Cash Singh, who's kind of a hero. He came to Britain as a 6-year-old, couldn't speak English, he rose up through the police force, and became a commander in Manningham in Bradford, which had terrible riots in 2001 and earlier. And he was a great commander, and he brought the crime rates down. He retired, and then he wanted to give something back. And he said, one of the things that was missing for me is that what we need to do is that we need an organisation that people in this country can align themselves to showcase their passion, pride, and love for this great nation. And this song, which everyone's been so mean about, turns out to be written by 7, 8 and 9-year-olds and 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds. And Mr. Singh says they're apparently very upset about all the criticism. And in fact, if you only listen to the end bit, it does sound a bit sinister. But if you listen to the rest of it, it's really sweet and it's sort of nice. And it's about how we all celebrate our differences with love in our hearts, and we're united for never and we're never apart.
Well, I suppose the irony, though, Holden, is it's just not terribly British to do that, is it? I mean, that's the thing. That's why there hasn't been a One Britain Day before now. You know, it's not that people aren't patriotic. I mean, you can see with the football that people are prepared to be when they think there's a cause. Admittedly, that's for the individual nations. Team GB may be a better example at the Olympics. But when it comes to just having a day to say how great we are and we're Britain, there are all kinds of historical and contextual reasons why people feel awkward about that. But also, it's just fundamentally not part of the British character to be celebrating in that way.
Yeah, I think it's also part of the British character to mock any attempt to, certainly any feeling of top-down imposed conformity or patriotism. And I think, although this actually wasn't that, I think a lot of people who were criticising it thought that it had been created by the Department for Education.
Yeah, because the Department of Education backed it, didn't they? And they've been retweeting it. You know, but it'd be quite difficult, really, if you're the Education Secretary, to say this is a terrible idea, supporting the idea that all Britain should come together for a day of celebration. We do not support this. So, of course, they're going to retweet it.
Yeah, I think, as you say, national identity is really complicated in the UK, and that's partly because it is 4 nations in one. But it's also partly because the history of the empire means that Britain once considered large parts of the world to be British too, whether they wanted to be or not. And so working out a modern British identity that brings in Scottishness, Welshness, some Irishness, but not too much Irishness, and also all of the people and the culture and the identity that's now enmeshed in that Britishness because of the imperial past, but with people who now really want to be a part of that identity in the present. That's a really difficult thing to try and to build into a song. And as Theo says, this song is a very sweet way of attempting to do that. And I think a lot of the people who have mocked it hardest are either accidentally or deliberately misunderstanding it and presenting it as if it's actually a sort of populist right-wing attempt to project a particular kind of Britishness, which I think actually the entire aim of it is to counter that movement.
Yeah, and thus playing into the hands of the sort of GB News culture war brigades, Arion, because actually this is a song that's kind of for like woke, diversity-focused, all-inclusive Brittanness, and if you can't support that, people will say, you can't support that, you will never support anything under the British flag.
Yeah, and I went across to the Obon website to sort of see what they felt their mission was all about. And the sweetness and naivety of the song is kind of mimicked on the website itself. You know, their mission statement says the following things: that we want to see children grow up feeling safe and protected. We want children to develop their self-esteem, and every child to have an emotional and meaningful connection to the country. And they also want to eliminate hatred and intolerance and discrimination of any kind. So, you know, they're really kind of, you know, broad brush, easy to get behind statements, and you could easily see how that could fall into the trap of a culture war type scenario that you kind of sketched out. But at the same time, I think that Kash Singh, you know, I think his heart's in the right place, but I think he just didn't really have a terribly coherent view of what he wanted out of this day in particular. You know, one of the things that he wanted for children to do was to just have a minute clapping for people who helped during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, it wasn't even about nationalism, one of the things that he said he wanted for kids to be doing. So I think that really it's just a kind of naive, it's this collision of naivety and the appearance of something that looks a bit fascist if you only scratch the surface, but beneath it's fairly harmless.
Well, the song is a bit Tomorrow Belongs to Me, isn't it? I mean, the fact it was written by 8-year-olds and it's done so accidentally doesn't remove that fact. I mean, it does slightly make you shudder. I mean, Theo, the values that Arion just outlined are values that pretty much any nation on earth would be happy for children to get behind, possibly except Britain, for the reasons that Holden said. And I wonder, therefore, whether, in a way, you know, sarcasm and scepticism are the British values that children will learn from the reaction against this day. And actually, those are relevant. Those are kind of the ways that our society is constructed here.
Yeah, it quite made me laugh when I was thinking about this, and I was idly typing patriotism in Britain into Google. The third suggestion that came up was, is patriotism illegal in Britain? So it's quite interesting that, I mean, they've done in polls, but about a quarter of all Britons think there's actually something wrong, think there's something like a bit off about patriotism generally.
Wow.
And I guess the message, I think certainly self-deprecation is a big part of it, but also I suppose the message of it is that if you're going to do patriotism, it's got to be, it's a cultural artifact. It's got to be really well done. It's not going to, if you think about the songs that make it, like, I don't know, Jerusalem or Flower of Scotland, God Save the Queen, maybe not so much, but these are really great songs which are very sort of inspiring and great works of art. So you can't really just have a load of 7-year-olds trying to do it. It's not going to work. And you can't have an acronym like OBON.
I mean, this is maybe the achievement of, going back a while now, of Danny Boyle's opening ceremony at the Olympic Games, Holden. That was such a rare moment in our lifetimes where it felt, I know there were people that were criticising it probably for being a bit woke and liberal, but generally speaking, it felt like the country could get behind that vision of Britain, and it didn't feel awkward. That's so unusual, isn't it? It was unusual. That's what made it remarkable as a moment.
Yeah, it was. In fact, I'm almost getting goosebumps now with just you describing it, which is odd and very un-British, it feels. But no, I think it was an astonishing accomplishment to have so few people criticise it, and it really was a moment that brought together the nation, and I think partly because there was a feeling that it was probably incomprehensible to large parts of the rest of the world. It was something that we understood, and it was, I think, what made that work was partly the sort of cultural specificity of it. Like it related to things we all understood. And it had a sense of history too. You had that kind of broad sweep through British history, touching in on some of the key points, and touching particularly on 1948, which was the last time London hosted the Olympics, but it was also when the Empire Windrush arrived, and it was also the foundation of the NHS. So it just had those kind of landmarks in history and in a range of different visions of British history, and it was something that we could feel it made us feel like a large family in a way that I think, having this slightly more slightly less well thought through song, it really can't, and it was never intended to perform the same role, but it falls well short.
Arion, the foreigner in our midst, we've talked about Australia Day with you on this show before. As someone who's lived in Britain for a while but comes from somewhere else, do you think Brits just need to relax about patriotism a bit? Or do you think there just isn't a way to ever really make it work here?
I think there is a way to make it work, and maybe it's demonstrated in the last night of the proms, where you really do get to sing those songs that Theo was mentioning, Rule Britannia and Land of Hope and Glory and Jerusalem and so on, but do it in a way that is a little bit self-mocking and a little bit silly. And I think Britain has a good way with that, really, to be able to celebrate itself, but simultaneously undercut it in a way that I don't always detect with some of my fellow country people back in Australia. Sometimes some Australians really are hugely passionate, which I suppose some Brits are as well, but it feels to me as though there are more unself-consciously patriotic Australians than there are Brits. People here have a fairly healthy form of patriotism, which is always slightly undercutting itself.
Theo, do you think One Britain, One Nation Day will happen in 2022?
I'm sorry to say that I think it may peter out. I mean, I think it's very sad, because if you wanted to, if you're thinking about how to, people are often saying we need a British identity, we need a coherent, involving British identity. You could hardly come up with a better scenario than this policeman who's worked in some of these most sort of areas with the worst kind of ethnic strife in Britain, and it just hasn't worked, I don't think, on this occasion. But good luck to him.
Well, I'm going to pause the 1 minute worth of clapping that I had mandated for the end of the show and just say we'll play our anthem next week, but that is it for now. Thank you to Holden, Arion and Theo. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free. No singing necessary. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, proudly Sophie King, at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.